Welcome to part two of my series on the Rincon Hills. Now, these hills have had all these historic mining features identified, but they've been mistakenly identified because all these disturbances here are prehistoric. I showed it in part one, and I'm going to show it again in part two, and there's going to probably have to be a part three and a part four, if not more, just for this one little area because it is so complex. The prehistoric landscape art here is like nothing else I've ever seen. Now, some of these areas have names like the Cook Claim and the Morgan Mine. That just means somebody filed the paperwork to put a claim on some of these disturbances, and doesn't mean that anybody actually worked here historically. And I don't believe they ever did because there's really not the kind of economic value here to make it worth the kinds of disturbance you see here. These hills usually don't look like much in these satellite photos, but one of the most recent photos happens to have flat lighting and good coloration, and that really brought out this complex artwork. And these pictures scale up and down to all kinds of different scales, obviously meant to be viewed from different altitudes above the earth. I'm going to start by zooming in here right off of Interstate 25 and show you this cleared area. This is identified as the Cook Claims, supposed to be some sort of manganese placer or placer mining. I don't think there ever was such a thing as a manganese placer mine, but when geologists from the Bureau of Mines went out here and they assumed these were historic mining operations, they had to come up with something to call these things. Just within this little area here, there's probably 1,000 different little figures and faces if you orient it all the different angles and scales. It's pretty incredible. So I'm just going to show you some of the things I see here and how to read these. If you start on the far right, there's this dark red area that forms a face pointed towards the left or inward. The next light area also forms a face. If you go a little farther to the left, it's a dark figure here. It looks like a guy looking up into a mirror. This figure also has a light-faced half of it that's looking down and taking a bow. This looks like kind of a classical Shakespearean actor to me. If you look at the next light area, it's this large figure that's holding apparently maybe an axe, ready to behead this guy. Below that axe, there's this dark area here that's another figure. If you looked at those two figures alone in the middle, appears to be a Shakespearean actor on the right and like a kabuki actor on the left, because it has these really exaggerated eyelashes. So there's like two different cultures, theatrical history depicted right here in southern New Mexico. As you look at more of it, there's heads on the left, and there's even like animals looking down at this performance here. And incredibly, it's been engineered on this 3D surface, all these hills out here. It's a pretty amazing accomplishment. And I wanted to show a couple different ways to look at this. If you see a dark face looking down in the middle there, it's like a guy wearing this white colored robe looking down on this other figure, and in his arm he has this round object. I think this could possibly be something that you actually see in Chinese art. That I believe this is some sort of aerial bombing device. Chemical fire is what it looks like in this picture, where it's burning the skin off of people. And if you compare those objects in that Chinese writing and this object here, I think it could be the same kind of device. I think these people were paragliding, flying, and that they were dropping these kinds of things on other people. Another way to look at this area is to see the light area as a figure kind of bending over to the left and blowing air, and has a wing on his back. It looks kind of like some of these Mesoamerican paragliding devices I see in their artwork. And then a couple other faces. Here's a gorilla facing to the right, and then another animal figure facing to the right. If you reverse the color, sometimes you see details you didn't see before. In this case, I started looking at the really darker area and saw that there's this turbaned figure with both arms back, getting ready to throw like four spiked balls on the end of whips is what it looks like. You can see the turning of the body and that this figure might be female. It's much harder to make that out without reversing the colors. If we flip this around so that west is at the top, there's a whole different set of artwork. It forms a whole different picture. A person with a parrot in the lower portion here, and it's pretty detailed and apparent. There's also different figures above that, almost an archangel looking figure and a large dark head at the top, and you could see that maybe like that. If you flip it over so that south's at the top, you get a whole different picture and a bunch of little characters. This is zoomed in quite a bit. In the middle you have this guy with a helmet. It looks like his body is almost a mortar shape and has a phallus coming out of it. You see on top of the phallus there's another little character. What's interesting is above that guy with the helmet is this little guy that appears to be parachuting down onto his head and kicking him in the brain. And I think this is one of those standard stories the Aztecs had about this balance between the needs of the nobles and the elite and the needs of the kingdom. So when the nobles and elites didn't work hard enough and started getting into debauchery and other things, they could be punished. The reason being is that they had to keep the people concentrated on what their ultimate goal was, which was to create this empire in the Valley of Mexico. So they needed people to keep being productive. They were building their population and they were building their productivity so that they could go south and take over. Even some of these smaller disturbances, you can see about 3 or 4 or 5 different ways you can see faces in this tiny little spot of disturbance. And then there's also the figures in the negative. So the light color here again forms this big head and face in the middle of this frame. Now if you flip it around with east towards the top, it forms one of the most incredible scenes I've ever seen. This is just so cool. It's this guy that's feeding a bear who appears to be swimming just under the water line. It's not quite the right angle in these first ones. You can even see that the bear forms a hat on this other guy below. And I'm going to show you that there's so much more here as we zoom out. So if you start in the lower middle where there's this bear that's swimming along looking up at this guy that's feeding him, if you go to the left of the bear you see there's this shark that's nudging him along. Go to the right of the bear, there's this head of a sheep it looks like. And if you go below you see that this bear and this sheep form headdresses on other faces below. If you go all the way to the right, you can see there's a face looking back to the left. And so in a couple of these shots, I sort of interpreted what I thought was the water line here and made it a little blue so that you could kind of get an idea of what this picture is showing. Now above, and there's a figure standing up and he's holding on to this tow rope and he has this big elaborate headdress. And again, if you look through all kinds of prehistoric art, you'll see that people were using these paragliding and flying devices. And the big headdresses were probably used as a counterbalance because human beings have a low center of gravity and aren't meant to fly, so they need something to help balance them. These devices also appeared to have all kinds of little attachments, stones hanging down, feathers, strings, different things that I believe would let the operator know which way they're tilted, the wind speed and direction, if they're in an updraft, give them all those kinds of information that they would need. I'd also point out that this upper figure that appears to be taking off with a paraglider has another little figure between the legs and another figure crouching behind. And I believe some of these devices were actually meant to haul several people into the sky at once. Again, there's elaborate drawings in Mesoamerica showing these big throne devices with ropes and people pulling them, and I believe that those were the nobles and royals' flying thrones, so to speak. And I'm going to have to move on to some other areas. I barely really touched upon what's here. Every time I look at it, I see another figure, another face. It makes me think that it's almost an infinite number of ways to look at it. I know that it can't be, but I can't figure it all out. There's just too much there. So now I'm going to move a little farther west. There's this whole big reddish area, forms like a really large scale head and figure. Another figure walking. There's all kinds of things going on here. A guy paragliding. And this is at a large scale, looking at this whole thing as one big picture. But I'm going to zoom in now to the north of the freeway. If you zoom in and look at this area, all this reddish area above the freeway, along with all the other gray and light areas, basically the whole picture, you can drive yourself crazy looking at all the various faces that can pop up out of this. But I'm going to zoom in towards the middle there at the top of this red rock formation. In this area you can see how all this red rock has been piled up to form this figure. It's almost a classic European figure, like a lion's symbol on a flag. This dark area is just part of it. If you look at the light area to the left, it forms a face facing to the left, and coming out of the mouth is all this really complex glyph system. And I believe this might actually be some hieroglyphic writing. I know for sure that this must represent speech. So this is just more evidence that the tribes of people that were here building all these glyph systems, this landscape art, were from all parts of the world, here being Europe. In that same red rock formation farther south, right north of the freeway, you can see this big red hand kind of coming at you, and then you see a red face and head in the middle. But there's so much more here when you look at the light areas and all the contrasting scrapes and disturbances here. There's a whole different ways to look at this. You can zoom in and look at a little character in a boat, or on the left there's this kind of fantasy looking creature that's feeding these other animals from its mouth. And this is all made with all these little berms and disturbances. You might think, well, those are cattle tanks, or they're some sort of settling ponds for mining, but this isn't on flat ground. All these things are on the sides of hills. When you look at a reverse color image, you can see how that eye almost looks realistic. As you change the colors, you can see more details, and I drew out here some of what I see. It's not exact, but that's kind of what's there. If you flip it around with east towards the top, you might be able to see a little better. There's this skull-like face facing straight up. That feature that looked like an eye in the other character now forms the ear of this character. It's, when you reverse it, it's the dark area, skull-like face looking upward. You can also see faces in the light area. And this is how it's all made. If you look close, it's all raked. And not only just raked in one direction, it's raked in all different directions to create these brush strokes on the landscape. They brought in and some of this soil, or they scraped down to different color soils in some areas. You can also see the grid system they used here. All this would have had to been done on paper and then scaled up using a grid system. And there's the surface it's all built on. It's this rolling hills. It's not a flat painting surface that would be easy to do this on. It's all very complicated. Now if you flip it over with west at the top, you kind of stand back a little bit, you can see a character on the right looking to the left at his hand. Or you can see on the left, the dark area looks like a man's face wrapped up in a scarf looking to the right towards a turtle. And that's just part of what's there. So look again at these hills. This is what all this is built on. Can't see it when it's this kind of lighting, but when you get a satellite photo that has direct lighting and good color, you can see all these various shades and colors and disturbances. And in a future video, I'm going to show you at this scale the faces that it forms. So there you have it, some of the most complex art I've ever seen, and it's created on a 3D surface in our desert in southern New Mexico.